In typical walking, it's said that when your leg swings forward, your heel will hit the ground first. This is called the heel strike, and it's easily observed. The forefoot is typically seen quite elevated when the heel strikes. We can also sometimes see that when the back foot is lifted, the sole of the foot faces backwards and is entirely visible. You won't always see this, but it is actually quite common. This all happens because the leg is severely bent, carried, and then extended out forward, forming a very long stride. Look at how far apart the feet are in this photo of a man who seems to be casually walking. He's going to then get his back leg that far forward of his front leg on the next step. That is a very long stride. If we go a step deeper into this, what's happening is that the person is contending with the fact that their torso is never lifting during the walking process. By that, I specifically mean that they are never going up on their toes, which is, in a sense, lifting the torso. Because there is no lift, the legs have to bend to be able to swing underneath the torso without scraping on the ground and potentially causing a trip and fall. The typical leg swing has the lower end of the thigh going forward very quickly, with the foot subsequently making a very quick acceleration to land with the forefoot elevated and the heel down. The leg is not extended until it's been swung past the part of the ground that would interrupt the swing of the leg, which causes the foot to shoot forward. But striking the ground with your heel like this is not at all a good way to take the impact of your weight hitting the ground. People are landing with their forefoot elevated, their heel angled, and their leg forward of their pelvis. The force from the ground will tend to push the greater trochanter at the top of the leg here back, which will coincide with the pelvis tipping forward and shortening of the back. Everything is of course connected. This is certainly how I walked for the first 20-some years of my life, and you can perhaps easily imagine how strong of a habit this could become. If you think about it, you'll probably recognize that your feet scraping on the ground is something that almost never happens. It might happen if you're very tired or maybe feeling quite lazy. I recall as an adolescent, I would sometimes scrape my feet to show a kind of lazy defiance, and I was told by my parents not to do that. Our habit of lifting the leg to swing it is to some degree tied into a fear of scraping our foot along the ground. This is obviously not a genuinely frightening fear, but allowing one's feet to scrape along the ground is something that most people do not allow in the normal course of their life. It does pose a certain amount of danger from tripping, meaning there is good reason to make sure it doesn't happen. And so people tend to bend their knee very significantly so that there is no chance their foot will scrape along the ground. If you've seen the earlier episodes in this series, you should already know our perspective on all this is totally different. Because we will go up on the toes in order to gain the clearance we need to swing the back leg, the problem of scraping the foot is not particularly relevant. We certainly don't need to overly bend our leg as it swings to avoid this danger. By walking differently, we're really not at a threat of scraping our foot and tripping, and so this coping strategy to prevent scraping makes no sense for us. Here I want to point out that our subconscious or conscious conception of how an act is done observably has a huge influence on how we perform the act. We don't need to consciously think about it to understand that our foot will scrape on the ground if we don't find a way to lift the foot as it swings. That is, if we are walking in the typical fashion. We find a way out of that problem subconsciously by bending the leg. That becomes a subconscious habit that can only be broken through conscious intervention. Now we're going to look at an excellent way to experiment with walking. It's highly suitable for a beginner, but useful for everyone. The idea is to walk while scraping the front of the feet along the ground. We could say scraping the toes along the ground, though to be clear, I'm talking about the metatarsal part of the toes, not the phalanges or the toes themselves. What you want here is for neither foot to come off the ground as you walk. In the series on the legs, we defined a point called the big toe or the head of the first metatarsal. We can make it so that the heads of all the metatarsals scrape on the ground as we walk. This is obviously not possible on every surface, but barefoot or in socks on carpet works well. The idea here is to maintain extension of the leg throughout the act of walking. We don't want to exaggeratedly show the sole of our foot to those behind us and then land with the heel down and the sole showing forward. We want to keep both legs extended and scrape the feet along with the heel elevated. Obviously, this is not how we want to always walk, but it helps us experiment for two reasons. Remember, we are up against a fantastically strong habit. Walking like this forces us into doing something different from what we think of as walking. Walking in this way will also tend to force you to take smaller steps. As we've seen, these longer steps are wrapped up in the shortening to walk habit. This procedure is very broad. It's just to walk while scraping your feet. So what's really interesting is to apply all the directions we've looked at in this series while scraping the feet. Does it help you prevent a massive bending of your knees? Can you keep your heels out and the sides of your feet straight as you walk like this? Can you slow down your mid-torso so it doesn't poke forward as you walk? Find a place where you can comfortably scrape your feet on the ground. Do a little experimenting, then join me next episode for another step forward.